There are places in the world where silence feels heavier than sound, where the air hangs as if it remembers something that the living should never know. And the narrow rows of a cornfield are one of those places. The stalks stand tall and motionless. But there is a strange truth whispered among those who have walked through them after sunset. Corn absorbs sound. And in the wrong moment, even footsteps seem to disappear into the dry leaves, as if swallowed by something unseen. On one unremarkable evening, long before anyone understood the weight of what happened there, a beam of pale flashlight light slid across the endless rows and trembled before settling on a patch of disturbed soil. The person holding that light did not speak, because something in the air warned against making a sound. There was a faint rustle deep within the rows, not caused by wind, not caused by animals, but by something that moved deliberately, patiently, and with an intention that sent a cold pressure through the ribs of anyone who heard it. The cornfield stood beneath a moon that seemed too thin, too distant, and too faint to offer comfort. The person with the flashlight felt the stalks on both sides lean inward, almost as if the field itself was breathing around them. The rustling paused, then resumed, but it moved in a way that seemed to circle, closing the distance with slow precision. Then came the sound that survivors later described in hushed voices, a light tapping, not on metal or wood but on corn stalks themselves. It's as if fingers were sliding along the dry leaves with quiet curiosity. The tapping moved from one row to another, as if something was pacing just a few feet away, hidden behind the living walls. The person lifted the flashlight and tried to trace the movement. But the beam seemed weaker there, as if the darkness carried weight. The air grew colder, the earth felt soft under their shoes, and the smell of soil rose sharply, mixing with something faintly metallic. They took a careful step back, and the tapping stopped. Silence followed, but it was not the silence of a peaceful night. It was a silence with a pulse. Almost as if something in the field was holding its breath in unison with the person standing there. A low, almost inaudible exhale drifted through the rows. The person froze. The sound was too close, too human, and far too deliberate to be anything natural. They slowly turned the flashlight toward the right, and for a single second, the beam caught something tall, swaying back between the stalks. Something with a shape that did not belong to any crop or creature known in that town. They felt the overwhelming instinct to run, but their legs refused to move. The corn around them shifted, not from wind, but from weight. Something stepped closer, bending the stalks in a slow, confident motion. Then came the whisper. Not words. Just breath. A thin, cold breath brushing the back of their neck. The flashlight fell from their hand and struck the soil with a dull thud. The beam rolled across the ground, lighting up the rows in a trembling line until it pointed toward a single broken stalk lying in the path. The person reached for the light, but before they could touch it, the corn directly behind them parted in a clean vertical line, as if something had pushed through with silent ease. A shadow fell across their shoulders. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the stalks swaying inward, closing around them like fingers curling into a fist. Days later, people from the town walked the length of that field under the safety of daylight, searching for footprints, clothing, anything. They found the flashlight, still lying on the soil where it had fallen. They found the broken stalks that seemed to trace a path deeper into the field, as if something had dragged weight behind it. But they did not find the person who held the light. The cornfield remained still, almost peaceful in the sun. But those who stepped inside said there was a pressure in the air that felt wrong. Something was missing. Something had been taken. And something in the rows felt aware of every step. The field felt alive. The question that echoed through the community, whispered at kitchen tables and gas station counters, was simple but unsettling. If the cornfield had been empty that night, then what moved between the rows with such careful patience? And what waited for the moment when the person with the flashlight stood alone in the dark? Asterisk. The cornfield had belonged to the land long before anyone in the nearby town understood what it carried within its tall walls. Generations had planted rows upon rows of corn in the same fertile soil, believing the land was predictable, manageable, and ordinary. Even though the older families often glanced at the fields with an unspoken caution that newcomers never fully understood, the town was small enough that everyone knew which house once held sorrow, which barn carried stories of accidents, and which field demanded a respectful distance after dusk. This particular cornfield stood at the edge of the oldest road, where the pavement thinned into cracked gravel and the trees leaned inward, as if trying to warn anyone who passed that the stretch of land ahead was not as empty as it appeared. The families who lived nearby often spoke of the field in carefully chosen words. They said the soil was rich but restless. The harvest was plentiful but never felt earned, and the nights carried a stillness that felt unnaturally deliberate. The younger residents dismissed these remarks as the usual exaggerations of rural life. But there were moments when even they felt the air shift as they walked home after sunset. The field never produced wind the way normal crops did. Its stalks swayed with a rhythm that felt too calculated, too synchronized, as if something unseen directed them from beneath the surface. Years before the night when the flashlight dropped into the soil, there had been smaller events that never reached the newspapers, never gained the attention of outsiders, but settled into the collective memory of the community. Farmers spoke of hearing low, dragging sounds that traveled beneath the rows long after midnight. A man once claimed he saw the corn part on its own while he stood at the edge of the field with his dog. Even though the air was still and the night had no breeze, children who dared each other to run between the rows always returned pale, saying the stalks felt warm to the touch, as if they held the heat of something living rather than the temperature of the night. But the adults dismissed these claims in quiet tones, because acknowledging them directly would force them to consider that the land they depended upon might hold something they did not control. Yet the field was not simply a landscape. It was tied deeply to the life of the town. Families relied on its harvest for income. Seasonal workers learned the pattern of the rows until they could walk them blindfolded. Parents warned their children to stay near the edge but never explained why. There was a man who tended the field each year with a quiet devotion, as if he felt responsible for something unspoken. He walked the outer edge every evening before home, pausing at specific rows with an expression that resembled both concentration and dread. Some evenings, he would return home later than expected, mud clinging to the soles of his shoes, even after long periods without rain. When asked if he was concerned about the strange noises or the unsettling stories that drifted around the field, he spoke with a fatigued certainty, saying the land had always been restless, long before anyone alive could recall. He said the soil held memories that never truly left, memories that seemed to echo beneath the stalks even when no one walked the rows. People listened politely, but they never pressed for more. Those who did press found the man suddenly quiet, almost as if he feared speaking would wake something that preferred to remain unmentioned. The field changed every autumn. There were seasons where the rows grew taller than expected, dense enough that a grown adult could not see more than a few feet ahead. Other years, the rows bent inward in strange patterns, even though there were no storms. The town explained these changes with practical reasons, because practical explanations allowed them to continue living without fear. But there were nights when those explanations grew thin. Nights when the sound of rustling traveled across the field with no source. Nights when headlights from passing cars caught strange, long shadows crossing between the rows. Nights when dogs refused to walk near the edge, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on something their owners could not see. Before the disappearance, there had been a quiet worry in the community that no one wanted to acknowledge. A few people sensed a pressure in the field that seemed stronger than previous years, as if something beneath the soil was becoming impatient or aware. The man who tended the field walked the perimeter more often, sometimes standing motionless at the same row until the moonlight shifted across his face. People watched from the road at a distance, uncertain whether they were witnessing a ritual, a precaution, or simply a man fighting with the fear he had carried for too many seasons. And through all its history, all its whispered stories, all its uneasy decades, there remained one question that no one dared to give voice to. If the cornfield felt alive at night, then what exactly breathed with it, listened through it, and waited beneath its shifting rows for someone to step inside? In the weeks leading to the night of the disappearance, the cornfield began to behave in ways that even the most practical minds in the town could not fully explain. Though they tried with determined insistence to keep their thoughts rational, it started with small details that seemed harmless at first. Workers who entered the field during the day began noticing odd patches where the soil felt unnaturally soft, as if recently disturbed, yet there were no footprints, tire marks, or signs of animals. Only the surface layer held form, and the earth just beneath seemed loose, unsettled, and strangely warm. A few workers mentioned hearing faint movements that sounded as though something was shifting deep within the rows. But whenever they turned their heads or called out, the sound vanished instantly. The older workers kept their comments to themselves, muttering about late-season insects or ground animals, though their voices carried more doubt than confidence. Soon after, the strange occurrences gained weight. One afternoon, a group of workers cutting down dry stalks paused when they heard what they believed was someone walking several rows over, moving in parallel with them. They called out, expecting a fellow worker or a wandering teenager, but no answer returned. The footsteps stopped when they stopped and resumed when they resumed, always keeping pace but never revealing a presence. The group eventually stepped out of the field, their nerves hidden behind forced laughter, but their eyes betrayed an unease that clung to them for the rest of the shift. When the foreman asked what had unsettled them, they simply shook their heads and refused to elaborate, because explaining the feeling would require admitting that something in the rows had been following them with quiet intention. Nights became worse. Residents living near the edge of the field began waking to odd sounds drifting through the dark. Some described a rhythmic dragging, like something thick moving slowly through the soil. Others heard low, breathy exhalations that seemed to rise from beneath the earth itself. A family living closest to the field reported seeing a dim light flicker between the rows after midnight, a light that was far too low to be from a lantern or phone. The glow moved with a strange slowness, weaving through the corn as if searching for something or someone. When the husband stepped outside with a flashlight, the glow blinked out instantly, swallowed by the rows. The next morning, he found his porch door slightly open, even though he remembered locking it. And the footprints in the dirt did not belong to him or his family. They were narrow, unusually deep, and pointed directly toward the cornfield. Stories spread quietly. A driver passing the field late one evening claimed he saw something tall move across the road before disappearing into the rows. He described the shape as distorted, as if the darkness stretched it into a form that did not resemble anything human or animal. He drove home trembling. But he said nothing to anyone until the disappearance forced the town to acknowledge every unsettling detail they had ignored. Another resident reported hearing soft tapping on their window during the night. When they looked outside, there was no one there. But the corn nearest to their house was bent in the same direction, all leaning toward their window as if pulled by an unseen hand. They told themselves it was wind, even though the trees were still and the night carried the heavy, suffocating quiet that had begun to settle over the entire area. There was also the matter of the field's internal paths. Workers who walked the same routes daily began noticing strange new channels carved through the rows, narrow and clean, as if something had moved through with careful precision. These paths did not resemble human-made trails, nor the erratic lines animals typically created. They were too straight, too deliberate, and they appeared overnight without any sign of disturbance around them. The man who tended the field examined the paths in silence, pressing his hand against the soil and standing motionless for a long time, as if listening for something beneath the surface. When others asked what he thought created the patterns, he simply said the soil was shifting in ways it had not shifted before. His answer gave no comfort, because his tone implied he believed the explanation was far worse than the words he allowed himself to speak. Then came the night when the workers found the first broken stalks. A cluster of tall corn had collapsed inward as if crushed by weight, but the soil showed no footprints. The damage spiraled outward in a pattern that made no sense, as if something had turned in circles before disappearing deeper into the rows. The workers stood around the collapse in silence, their breathing tight, each one knowing instinctively that the pattern did not belong to machinery, storms, or wildlife. Something had moved there, something heavy enough to bend stalks but careful enough to leave the ground unmarked. Some of the workers refused to return the next day, claiming they had family emergencies or sudden illnesses. But the truth settled quietly among those who remained. The cornfield had begun to stir in a way they could no longer pretend to understand. Something inside it was awake, and whatever it was seemed to be waiting for the moment when someone would step just a little too far into its darkened maze. After the disappearance, the cornfield became a place that people approached carefully, as if the rows themselves were listening to every step, every breath, and every careless word spoken about what happened. The investigators who arrived in the town tried to carry themselves with confident authority, but even they paused at the edge of the field, noticing how the stalks rose taller than their shoulders, creating a corridor of pale yellow walls that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. They entered with clipboards, flashlights, and analytical certainty, yet each one felt an uneasy pressure in the soil beneath their boots, as if the earth held a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Their first discovery was the flashlight lying half buried in the soft dirt. Its casing was scratched, and the switch was still functional. The investigators lifted it with gloved hands and noted the odd angle at which it had landed. It almost as if it had been dropped, mid-movement rather than placed or thrown. A few feet away, they found the broken stalks forming a narrow path that spiraled into the field. But the path ended abruptly, vanishing as if whatever created it had simply dissolved into the rows. The investigators examined the area, tools meant to measure soil density and track disturbances. But the readings made no sense. The topsoil appeared firm in some patches and strangely loose in others, yet not a single print matched the weight distribution of a human stride. The nearest footprints, belonging to the missing person, were clear up to a certain point, and then they simply stopped. It was as if the person had been lifted off the ground or absorbed into the earth without resistance. One investigator suggested ground collapse, but ground collapse left depressions, and there were none. Another suggested a hidden burrow or an animal hole, but the size required would have been enormous, and the soil showed no tunneling patterns. They found marks on several stalks at shoulder height where something had brushed against them, but the pattern was uneven, and the distance between the marks suggested a height and build that did not align with any known creature in the region. The townspeople gathered near the edge of the field in quiet clusters, whispering about what the investigators might find, though many feared the answer more than the uncertainty. Some offered stories from previous seasons, recounting odd sightings or strange noises, but their voices faltered when they reached the parts they had ignored for years. A few hesitantly described hearing muffled voices drifting from the rows long after midnight, voices that sounded as though they were imitating human speech without understanding its shape. One woman said she once found a piece of cloth snagged on a stalk deep in the field, but the cloth was damp with something she could not identify, something that smelled metallic and warm. Another resident recounted how he saw a row of corn part in front of him during a late evening walk, as if something invisible moved through the stalks with deliberate direction. He had dismissed it then, but now he wondered if that silent movement had been a warning. He chose not to acknowledge. The investigators collected samples from the soil, hoping to find traces of wildlife or human activity. Under the microscope, the soil revealed unusual patterns. The granules were arranged in thin, stratified layers, as if repeatedly shifted by something passing through them. It resembled the marks left by underground water flows or burrowing animals, yet the pattern was too symmetrical, too controlled. One investigator remarked that the soil looked disturbed from below, as though something had traveled through the earth in a slow, calculated path. When he voiced this observation, the others grew tense, because it matched too closely with the quiet testimonies of the workers, who claimed they felt vibrations under their feet weeks earlier. Another troubling discovery emerged when they examined the stalks that formed the spiral-like collapse. The stalks bore faint indentations, almost like fingerprints, but far too long and too narrow to belong to a human hand. The impressions ran vertically rather than horizontally, suggesting a grip unlike any natural creature in the region. The edges of the indentations were smooth, not torn or clawed, as if the stalks had been pressed by something with soft but powerful force. When the investigators presented their findings to agricultural experts, the experts could not provide a logical explanation. They pointed out that the indentations lacked pressure fractures typical of human interference. Whatever pressed the stalks did so with precision, not violence. Perhaps the most unsettling evidence came from the audio recordings one investigator placed inside the field. Overnight, he left small devices hidden between the rows, intending to capture sounds of wind, insects, or passing animals. When he reviewed the recordings the next day, the first hour contained nothing unusual. But as the night deepened, the microphones picked up faint patterns of movement. Soft drags, whispers of shifting stalks, and low exhalations echoed across the audio. At one point, the device recorded a slow, crisp tapping, similar to fingers sliding across dry leaves. The tapping repeated in a rhythm, paused, then returned, closer to the microphone as if whatever produced it had become aware of the device. The recording ended abruptly with a sharp crack followed by static. When the investigator returned to retrieve the device, he found it crushed into the soil, its casing bent inward. Yet the stalks around it stood perfectly untouched. The investigators could not agree on the cause. They all felt the same heavy truth as they stood at the edge of the cornfield. Something had moved with intention through the rows. Something that left no footprints, no tracks, and no clear shape, but left a silence so dense that it pressed into the mind like a warning. Whatever waited in that field did not act randomly. It watched, it listened, and it had learned the patterns of anyone who stepped inside. Asterisk in the days that followed. The emotional landscape of the town shifted in a way that felt heavier than any storm or tragedy they had known before, as if the disappearance had opened a wound in the soil that no one could see but everyone could feel. Families who lived near the cornfield began closing their windows far earlier than usual, not because the nights grew colder, but because they feared the faint sounds that drifted from the rows after sunset. The quiet that once felt peaceful now carried a pulse, a slow tremor that settled beneath their thoughts, like an echo they could not push away. Parents kept their children inside, inventing excuses about homework or chores, but the children sensed the tension anyway, noticing how their parents glanced toward the field with guarded eyes. The missing person's family moved through their home in a haze that felt both numb and sharp, a constant oscillation between hope and dread. They kept the porch light on through the night, even though they knew the chances were thin. Every distant noise made them stop and listen. Every shift of wind sounded like footsteps returning, and every creak in the house felt like a breath held too long. They tried to grieve, but grief could not begin when the fear of something unseen gnawed at them from the edge of their land. Neighbors who visited them came with casseroles and soft words, but their faces carried an unease that made the house feel colder. When conversations drifted toward the cornfield, the air grew tense, and people lowered their voices instinctively, as if the field might hear them from across the yard. Some visitors admitted they had been waking at night with a sense of pressure, as though someone stood beside their beds watching them. Others described dreams filled with rows of corn that stretched endlessly. Dreams where something tall and shadowed moved between the stalks with fluid, unnatural grace. These dreams left them gasping for air, as if the field followed them into sleep and refused to let them rest. The missing person's family listened with trembling hands, feeling each story tighten the knot in their chests. Because the dreams sounded too close to the fear they already carried, as days passed, small signs of emotional strain became impossible to hide. People began avoiding the road that ran past the cornfield, choosing longer routes even if they added 20 minutes to their morning commute. Those who had to drive that way found themselves gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. As they approached the gently swaying rows, they kept their eyes straight ahead, refusing to look into the corn. Because a few who had looked insisted they saw movement between the stalks that did not match the wind. One driver claimed he saw a shape parallel his car, moving at the same speed just a few rows in, but he refused to repeat the details after that first trembling confession. His hands shook for hours afterward, and he left the diner without finishing his coffee. The psychological tension deepened when animals began reacting in ways that unsettled even the most grounded residents. Dogs that once ran freely along the edge of the field now refused to approach it. They stood rigid, staring into the rows with raised fur and low growls, before backing away as if retreating from an unseen presence. Horses in nearby stables refused to stand near the fence on the side closest to the corn. Some paced in circles. Throughout the night, their breaths sharp and distressed. A farmer found his cattle clustered at the far end of their pasture one morning, pressed tightly together as though they sought protection in numbers. Their eyes remained fixed on the cornfield, unblinking, their bodies trembling despite the calm weather. These growing signs began to weigh heavily on the minds of the residents. The fear was not the kind that came suddenly, like thunder or fire, but the slow, suffocating dread that crept into daily life. People began losing sleep, waking with the sense that something had walked past their windows during the night. The absence of answers left them grasping for explanations, and in the hollow space between reason and fear, their imaginations filled with unsettling possibilities. Some believed the missing person had encountered something human, something dangerous but earthly. Others whispered that the field held a presence older than their town, something that lingered beneath the soil and waited for movement above. A few suggested that the land had grown resentful, as if years of being harvested and walked upon had stirred something deep within it. The emotional deterioration did not appear dramatic from the outside. It took the form of shorter tempers, longer silences, restless nights, and avoidance. Yet beneath these small behaviors was a growing collective conviction that the cornfield had changed forever. People felt watched when they passed it, as if invisible eyes tracked their movements with unblinking patience. Conversations about the field carried a weight that made the air feel thin, like breathing too close to a cold memory. The missing person was no longer the only fear. The greater fear became the unknown presence that had taken them, a presence the town could not name, confront, or predict. Every person felt the same unspoken truth settling into their minds. Whatever moved in that field did not simply hide in the rows. It listened. It learned. It understood fear better than any of them. Asterisk as investigators widened their search and spent more hours walking the boundary of the cornfield. The desperate need for answers forced them into uncomfortable territory, where logic strained under the weight of details that did not behave like anything familiar. Official reports attempted to establish timelines, but every version conflicted with itself. Some witnesses swore they heard the missing person call out, yet the direction of the voice seemed to shift, echoing from multiple places in the field at once. Others claimed they saw the beam of a flashlight moving deeper into the rows long after the person was believed to have vanished. But those same witnesses insisted the light moved in a way no person could, sliding horizontally as though gliding between stalks without disturbing them. Investigators tried to reconstruct the final movements of the missing person, but the absence of footprints created a void they could not fill. This void gave birth to theories that unsettled even the most rational minds. Some suspected an abductor, who knew the land intimately and possessed the physical precision to move silently through the rows. Yet no sign of struggle, no tracks, no foreign objects surfaced. Others suggested the missing person had fallen into a hidden sinkhole or an abandoned well. But extensive ground scans showed solid terrain beneath the entire field. A few whispered the possibility of a reclusive individual living off-grid in the cornfield, someone who learned to survive unseen. But even this explanation faltered under the weight of the evidence. There were no shelters, no footprints, no discarded tools or food remains. Nothing human left a trace. When official theories failed, town's older residents reluctantly offered the unsettling stories passed down through generations. Stories they had previously dismissed as superstition, but now carried a strange resonance. They spoke of nights when the field moved in ways that did not match the wind. They spoke of a presence that belonged neither to the living nor to the land. One elder recalled that her grandmother refused to walk near the field after dusk because she believed the soil held something restless beneath it, something that shifted with purpose. Another resident claimed his father once saw a shape rise between the rows, tall enough to cast a long shadow across several stalks, before sinking silently into the ground as if swallowed. These were stories never meant to be repeated in broad daylight, and as they surfaced, investigators found themselves writing notes they were almost embarrassed to look at afterward. Still, every strange detail in the field pushed them to consider possibilities they once believed impossible. A small team of specialists was brought in to analyze the soil and sound recordings. Their findings created new threads of unease rather than clarity. The soil samples showed layers of disturbance spaced out and narrow, precise patterns that suggested controlled movement rather than natural shifting. When asked if the patterns could belong to burrowing animals, one specialist responded with visible discomfort, stating that if an animal created those paths, it would have to be large, extremely quiet, and capable of altering direction with unnatural precision. The audio recordings amplified this discomfort. Experts isolated the tapping, the dragging, and the breath-like exhalations captured at night, comparing them against known wildlife signatures. No match emerged. The exhalations were too steady, too measured. The tapping lacked the irregularity of claws or paws. Instead, it sounded almost like fingers long, slow, and deliberate, testing the surface of the stalks as if learning their texture. As uncertainty grew, theories splintered into darker territories. Some investigators proposed a psychological explanation, suggesting the fear surrounding the field amplified normal sounds into something unnatural. But even they faltered when confronted with the crushed recording device, the missing footprints, and the mechanical precision of the bent stalks. Others considered the possibility of underground movement caused by shifting roots or hidden water flows, yet the patterns in the soil remained too symmetrical, too intelligent, as if shaped by thought rather than nature. A handful of residents whispered about something ancient in the land, something that existed before the town, before the farms, and before the first road was built. They spoke of the soil as if it carried memory, as if the field responded to those who walked too confidently within its walls. These theories gained a quiet following, not because people believed them fully, but because the alternative felt far more terrifying, that something unknown could move through the rows with awareness, choosing when to reveal itself and when to remain unseen. A final theory emerged among a small group of investigators who had spent the most time near the field. They noticed that certain rows felt colder, as if passing through pockets of air that held a temperature different from the rest of the night. They believed the field had pathways of its own, routes that something used repeatedly. They noticed that the birds avoided the center of the field entirely, circling wide arcs above it instead. They noticed that the rustling within the rows often followed their own movements, as if mirroring them. These details led them to a chilling, unspoken suspicion. Whatever moved in that cornfield not only lived, there it studied those who entered. It adapted. It learned. And it understood when fear had taken root deeply enough that no one would question its presence anymore. By the end of the initial investigation, the official report offered only a sterile summary, a passive conclusion that the disappearance remained unsolved. But those who walked the rows, those who stood beneath the oppressive quiet of the field, left with a far heavier truth lingering in their minds. The cornfield did not simply hide something, it held something. And that something moved with purpose. Asterisk, in the weeks that followed the failed investigation, the cornfield became less a physical place and more a presence that settled over every mind in the town, stretching into thoughts the way its rows stretched into the distance. People spoke of it less and less, not because they found closure, but because speaking its name aloud seemed to stir something in the air, a pressure that pushed back against the act of remembering. The missing person's family left a single lantern burning on their porch each night, its pale flicker reaching only a few feet into the dark, but always aimed toward the field. Neighbors noticed that the light never seemed to dim despite the hours, as if the lantern feared to fail while the field watched. The town changed in quiet ways. Morning conversations at the diner became shorter, eyes drifting toward the windows whenever a gust of wind shook the distant stalks. Children no longer rode their bikes past the field's edge. The laughter that once filled the summer evenings grew muted. Even the birds altered their flight paths without fanfare, rising higher when they crossed near the field, wings beating faster than before. Life resumed, but it resumed with a tremor beneath it, a hesitation woven into every movement. The town learned to coexist with the uncertainty, though it did so with a kind of resigned fear, as if accepting that some mysteries demanded distance rather than answers. Yet the field itself did not settle. At night, its rows swayed with their familiar rhythm, but the sound carried a different weight now, a deeper resonance that made the air near it feel strangely tempered. The soil along the perimeter remained soft in patches, as though something moved just beneath the surface, circling with patient intention. Those who walked past it claimed the ground vibrated faintly under their feet, as if breathing. The investigators who once believed the case was simply a tragic disappearance found themselves returning. Not officially, but out of a quiet compulsion they could not dismiss. They parked their cars at a distance and watched the rows ripple under the pressure of the unseen, remembering the audio recordings. The fingerprints on the stalks, the crushed device, and the path that ended too cleanly. One of them admitted privately that the field felt as though it had become aware of its own attention, adapting its silence in response to their presence. Another confessed that the dreams that had begun during the investigation had not stopped dreams where the rows closed around them, and a shadow moved between them with an in. Understanding far too precise to be chance, rumors began circulating again. Whispered between a few town elders who still respected the land in ways that younger generations had dismissed. They suggested the field had awakened because something had stepped on soil that preferred to be left undisturbed. Others claimed the missing person had not simply been taken, but chosen. There were hushed comments that the land had a memory longer than any of them, and that the cornfield served as a kind of boundary, keeping something beneath it contained until curiosity or confidence weakened the barrier. These ideas were dismissed publicly, but no one argued them privately. The fear had grown too quiet, too familiar, and too deeply rooted to confront. When the next harvest season arrived, the farmers who normally walked the rows with practiced ease refused to enter the field alone. They worked in pairs, speaking in low voices, refusing to linger when the wind shifted. Some stalks grew taller than expected that year, bending in odd angles as if shaped by a hand rather than nature. A few workers reported seeing long, smooth impressions on the stalks again, but they did not report them officially. The field had become something they endured rather than cultivated, as though they were tending a living thing that tolerated them only because it had always been that way. They sensed that if they pushed too far, asked too much, dug too deeply, the field might respond, and they did not want to know what form that response would take. The disappearance remained unsolved. The official files stored neatly in a drawer labeled with a case number that meant nothing to those who felt the weight of the truth. But for the residents, the case did not end. It simply slipped into the quiet spaces of their days, settling in like a shadow that did not need movement to be felt. The cornfield waited as it always had, standing tall and still in the daylight, its silence deceptively warm. But at night, when the horizon darkened and the breeze carried the scent of soil, the field seemed to stretch deeper, as if swallowing the darkness whole. Those who found themselves passing it after dusk felt an instinctive pull to move faster, to avoid looking between the rows. Because the sensation of being watched was too precise, too aware. A few claimed they heard soft tapping drift from the rows again, slow and deliberate, like a patient reminder that the field had not forgotten, and that it never would. And so the town lived with a question that grew heavier with each passing season, a question they feared to ask aloud but could not escape. Something in the cornfield had taken a single person without leaving a trace. How long would it wait before reaching for someone else?